Thank you so much. Good afternoon and welcome to the New Yorker Festival. My name is Dorothy Wickenden. I'm the executive editor of the New Yorker. You all know the work of our distinguished panel today, so I'm not going to go into a long introduction. Their biographies are in your booklets, so you can check if you want to see all the awards they've won. They do such extraordinary work at such risk to themselves, and this is one of the things we're going to be talking about today. And so I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. And I just want to tell you that in the few minutes before we came out, we were backstage, and it was like a class reunion. They all know each other. They've all worked together. It's a very small contingent over there. We're going to be talking today mostly about the war of the last 10 years, because they've all been there and done a lot of reporting from there. After the discussion, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions from the audience, and if you could please turn off your cell phones, we would be appreciate that. So please welcome Wendell Steavenson, Jon Lee Anderson, Lynsey Addario, and Dexter Filkins. And I just want to say that the photographs we're going to be seeing as such beautiful, extraordinary, in these big dimensions, are all by Lynsey, and we'll be seeing a fair number of them, and we'll be discussing them as we go. Dexter, I want to start with you. You recently published an article for The New Yorker about the murder of a well-known Pakistani journalist, and it was someone you had interviewed just the week before, as I recall. He was writing about some of the same issues that you've written about the complicity of the ISI in its involvement in assassinations and in terrorism. The ISI is Pakistan's intelligence agency. When you got to New York, you said that the country felt more dangerous than it ever had before. And so I want to ask you something that I'm sure the audience wonders, which is why did you go into this line of work?
You know, I was it's a long time ago, but I was thinking about going to law school. Thank God I didn't do that. And it's the cheesiest of answers. I went to a movie theater and I saw The Year of Living Dangerously. Some of you have probably seen that with Mel Gibson and Sigourney Weaver. And I thought, wow, I can work in a law firm or I can go do that. So, and that was, the movie set in Indonesia in 1965 was very. I like to think I do it for a bunch of different reasons. One is I think it's important, and the other is it's a lot of fun, and those two things are kind of they're the same thing when you're out there and you're kind of in these big large events and you can kind of watch history unfold in front of you, and you feel like you're in the middle of something really important and that you're doing something really important, but it's also anybody who says it's not a lot of fun wouldn't be telling you the truth. It's really, I've seen, particularly over the last 10 years, I feel like I've seen many, many lifetimes worth of events.
You have. And Jon Lee, I know that you agree with what Dexter's been saying. We reached you not very many weeks ago. You were on a rare vacation with your family in Maui. And it was becoming clear that the Gaddafi regime was on the verge of collapse. And as I recall, you called your editor and said, you were on the beach, and you said, I've got to go back to Libya. And I have to say, present company excluded, it's hard to think of many people who would leave the world's most beautiful beach to go back to a desert war where you were almost killed several times.
Yeah, it's true. I was with my kids and my sisters in Maui. I don't get to see that much, so having assembled this kind of family holiday and reunion, I felt pretty guilty about disassembling it. But my kids weren't too upset because they were able to stay on.
And they're used to it.
But for a few days, I should say for about 24 hours, I tried to will it away. I had actually made a bet with a friend that if either of us made any holiday plans in August, Gaddafi was bound to fall, and sure enough, it was like a bad omen coming true, and and then I had to fly. It was strange leaving a place like that and arriving in Tripoli. a city that had just collapsed.
Well, and because you were there covering the war, the uprising when it began, which was not many months earlier,
No.
5 months earlier, you described in that piece this ragtag band of rebels, some young boys who had never seen a gun before, and then you came back and the whole regime had collapsed.
Yeah.
I haven't even talked to you since you've gotten back. What did you find?
Well, I should also say something about the compulsion. Some of these experiences bind you to them in a way too. It goes beyond I agreed with everything Dexter said about this excitement of seeing history unfold and also the camaraderie being really important. But it was all about death too. Unusually, Libya was a place where, even more than some of the other places we've covered in the last 10 years, quite a few colleagues were wounded or killed or brutalized, and so there was an additional factor there. And the story I wrote in the spring was also about a man losing his son. So I always knew that I wanted to be there for the denouement, for the unfolding of the final drama. And however, I'd never been in Gaddafi's Libya, that is to say, Tripoli. And I arrived just as it was seeping out of sight. There was the last gunshots being fired. The loyalists were beginning to stop firing back, and in the next few days I would watch them begin erecting the new flag, and before long also joining everybody else in the renamed Martyrs Square, denouncing Gaddafi and hurrahing the revolution. But one witnessed a city, the capital city of a country in which there had only been one voice for over 40 years. And I think, we still see that in the news that we continue to read today, which is a very unsettled place, a place that doesn't really know its future, and which is still mapping out its identity. And I think there's going to be some score settling and some ugliness yet. But, this strange, almost random construct of a society through the whim and also the whimsy of one man, Gaddafi. Very, very strange place.
Lynsey, you were there in the early months, and we're going to show some. It's going to be hard for you to see, but we're going to be showing some photographs that you took of the opposition. And I wonder, what do you see? What are you looking for as a photographer that might be a little bit different, or is it the same as what Jon Lee is looking for when he covers a war like this?
I think when I'm covering a regime that is about to fall, I mean, there's most of us journalists go in when there's an opening to go into a country that the leader's going to fall. I think we're all looking for pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's a group of people who have been repressed for many, many years, and all of a sudden they're experiencing freedom for the first time. So Jon Lee and I actually were working together quite a bit, and we pushed up to the front line pretty soon after we were able to, and linked up with the rebels. And I spent about 3 weeks or 2.5 weeks on the front line with the rebels, just following them, pushing forward as they would push forward. And trying to photograph not only their fight and their lives, but also civilians fleeing the hospitals, what was happening if they were injured, basically anything we can get access to. But the one thing we did find is that most of the civilians had fled, or most people were staying indoors, so it was very hard to access anyone other than the rebels themselves. Unlike a lot of other militaries I've covered, these rebels had no experience at that point. They were it was terrifying, actually, to cover the front line with them, because as we would get hit with incoming fire, they would either turn around and run away and leave us just completely exposed, or they didn't really know how to fight back, and the terrain was very open. So we were covering a war and getting hit with tank fire. At that point, there were still airstrikes. There were helicopters coming in with gunships. I mean, there was shrapnel landing all around us, and the rebels were I didn't feel at all safe with them.
Well, and now I have to ask the inevitable question, which is something most people in the audience know, which is that you were kidnapped not very long after these photographs were taken. Where does kidnapping rank in the list of hazards of the job? It wasn't the first time, by the way.
It wasn't the first time. It was the first time in 7 years. it's hard to rank those things. I mean, I think, as Jon Lee said, we lost friends during this war. We lost two very good friends, Tim Hetherington and Chris Hondros, and that, of course, would rank the highest. I don't, they were killed a few weeks after we were released, and for me, I felt like we were so lucky. We actually came out of this alive and virtually unscathed. So I think it was a miserable experience, of course. We were held for 6 days and beaten up and tied up and blindfolded and held on the front line, of course, against our will, but as artillery and guns were firing, bullets were landing all around us, and we were tied up and couldn't move. And then we were shifted to another position and in the back of a truck, and then put in prison, and then eventually brought to Tripoli. But there was a lot of psychological trauma that went along with it, even beyond the physical. I think, the human being has an incredible way of just going into a sort of survival mode, and you can almost endure anything. But it's hard when people, they knew what they were doing. They would say, I was tied up at one point in the back of a truck, and this guy was just caressing my face, and in a very sort of tender way, which in and of itself is disgusting. I mean, you're tied up and being kidnapped, and then you have some random man just like touching you and caressing you, and he kept saying something over and over, and I said to Anthony, what is he saying? And he said, he's telling you you're going to die tonight. So, they mix this sort of very violent with the very sort of tender, which is really, every time we let our guards down and sort of became comfortable, they would pass us off to a new group of men who would then in turn reassert their power over us, and it was very violent.
Dexter, have you ever had any close calls?
Yeah, plenty of close calls. You mean with kidnapping?
Yeah, with kidnapping in particular.
Yeah, mine's a funny story.
That's okay. Just cut the tension a little bit.
Well, kidnapping, for me, kidnapping's always been, when you go, it's always the most likely thing to happen, almost always, because when you show up in a really poor country and I look like a foreigner, you're just basically a pile of money to these people, and so if anybody grabs you, whether it's a kind of, a militant or an insurgent or somebody or just some criminals, they know somebody somewhere is going to cough up a lot of money to get you out, and so that's always my main fear. I mean, unless I'm kind of right on the front line and dodging bullets, but I do have kind of there was one. This is a few years ago in Iraq, but I had this wonderful interpreter, a Kurdish guy named Wazir Jaff, who now lives in New York City. But this was in Baghdad, maybe 2005, and I wanted to go interview this Sunni sheikh who was kind of uncertain allegiance, which meant he was like virtually every Sunni sheikh in Iraq. But we went and we didn't really know very much, and we went to his house somewhere and in Baghdad, and we sat down and Jaff, he and the sheikh and Jaff immediately got into this very, very long conversation in Arabic. And so I don't speak a word of Arabic, so I just kind of sat there for a while as they talked. And it was a very involved conversation. And, I got a little impatient, and I was saying, Jaff, can we, start the interview? And Jaff kept, and Jaff's an amazing guy. He looks like Clint Eastwood, and he carries a gun. Some of you know him. Anyway, this went on, and they talked for about a half an hour, and it got very heated at one point, and then Jaff finally said, okay, ask your question. And we had a very nice conversation, went on for about an hour with the sheikh, and, I love America, all that. And so we were finally going home, a couple hours later, and I turned to Jaff, and I said, what were you guys talking about back there that went on so long? And he said, well, he wanted to kidnap you. And he said, this American here, we can get him, and, $1 million for you and $1 million for me. And again, this was unfolding in front of me. I had no idea. And Jaff, it just so happens, and Jaff informed the sheikh. He said, I come from the biggest tribe in Kurdistan, and it's a lot bigger than your tribe. And if you try anything like that, my tribe is going to crush your tribe. And the sheikh, said, okay, it was just an idea. Okay, tea for everybody. But anyway.
Okay, because you've all been in this region for almost the time that our forces have been in the region, I thought it'd be interesting to go back and talk about sort of the early days in Iraq and some of the work that you did there. Wendy, as I recall, you were in Kurdistan and perhaps covering your first war right before the ground invasion. How did that go?
I think that was kind of Jon Lee's fault, actually, half. I was living in Tehran. And you came to stay in Tehran, and Iraq was looking like it was going to be a big war next door, and it seemed almost incredible and unbelievable that the Americans would actually invade, that this wasn't going to be a bluff. And I remember you left Tehran in January 2003 to go to Jordan to get a visa, and the last thing you said to me as I was wavering, should I go to Kurdistan and come down south, should I go? I was scared. I was working for a British newspaper, but I just had a stringing job. I had no big backup. I had no chem suit, no satellite phone, none of this kind of stuff. And he just, as you were leaving, you just said, "Yeah, see you in Baghdad, girl."
And you didn't give her advice on the flak?
I'm sure I did. This is the truncated version. Yeah.
But I remember, I think what you're alluding to is I remember waking up a couple of days into the ground invasion in Kurdistan, in the north, where nothing was happening, apart from the fact the Kurds had all decamped left the cities and run into the mountains, as Kurds are very good at doing. They pack up immediately, put everything on the trucks, and they've done it enough times now. And it was quiet in the north, in Sulaymaniyah, and it was kind of ominous and weird, and we were watching the CNN footage from the south, and I woke up at sort of 3 or 4 in the morning to this rumbling, heavy sound, and completely freaked myself out, thinking, oh my God, it's the bombing, it's heavy, blah, 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 to very slowly realize that it was a thunderstorm.
Jon Lee, one of the really extraordinary pieces you did from Iraq was about a surgeon, Allah Bashir, who was close to Saddam, actually, and a talented artist. Tell us a little bit about him, your relationship with him, how that's representative of kind of how you get to know sources and what he told you about Iraq under that dictator.
It was probably one of my most interesting relationships evolving out of a reporting experience. I had gone to Iraq in 2000 at a time in which nobody was really talking about Iraq. To try to do a profile of Saddam Hussein, who at the time was a fearful man who had been left in power by us and our allies in 1991 after the first Gulf War, I'd always had a sort of ominous presentiment that meant that there would be another war, although I never envisioned what happened in 2003. And I was appalled and fascinated by Saddam because he was the world's first and only, in my time anyway, clandestine president, head of state. Nobody ever saw him. And so I managed to, I made a few contacts. Curiously enough, came via Cuba, and I met a diplomat of Saddam's in Vienna, who in turn gave me several letters to close friends of his. And he told me about one man in particular that I must see, who was a doctor and an artist, and the closest person I would ever get to Saddam, and that maybe he in turn could get me to Saddam. And this turned out to be Allah Bashir, who was this extraordinary figure, the director of a hospital, and we had a very bad first encounter. I remember he had a fly swatter. It was August in Baghdad, which means that it's about 125 degrees. And he just swatted flies throughout our encounter and tried to appeal to me to believe that Saddam was really misrepresented by the Western media. And he used Adolf Eichmann as an analogous figure who had been misrepresented by the press and who could never get a fair press. And so, it was a fascinating encounter. I spent about a month in Iraq. We met several times, and I ended up doing a profile of a virtual president because, of course, I never did get to see Saddam. I returned in 2002 in the run-up to the war, and again in 2003, and Allah Bashir saw me again, told me in our first meeting that he hadn't liked the profile of Saddam, but nonetheless encouraged me to follow up with him in sort of to drop by his office and have tea and talk with him, and we established a sort of bond. He was a sensitive and cultured man, and I was fascinated by the path he had taken in life that had brought him to this position where he was something of an oracular figure to Saddam Hussein. As the invasion neared, our visits became more and more frequent. He began to realize that the world he had been a part of was coming to an end. And a couple of weeks before the invasion, he revealed himself to me. He told me that everything that I had ever imagined about Saddam was true. In other words, all of the disappearances, all of the murders. And in other words, he laid his life on in my hands, which bonded us even more. Anyway, he emerged in some of my pieces as an anonymous figure, someone who was able to tell me what was happening, what the thinking was, close to Saddam at a very crucial time. And it wasn't until after the invasion was successful that I was able to write about him and reveal him as a character. Soon afterwards, of course, he had to flee the country himself for fear of assassination. Not entirely my fault, but he was... of course, none of us knew that a new war was coming in those messy weeks after the invasion, as crazy and terrible as they were in some ways. But he was a very, very recognizable figure. And and we have stayed in touch over the years, ever since. So it's now, 11 years I know him. Every Christmas he sends me a Christmas card. He splits his time between England, because he was a resident doctor there. He had 2 sons that were born there. And Qatar, where he's under the protection of a brother of the emir. And I found out that the extent of his relationship with Saddam in the immediate aftermath of the war, which included, for instance, advice on some of Saddam's palaces. There was a palace that we used to pass in Baghdad, which was an extraordinary place. And when Saddam was in power, you couldn't look at it for too long, just as you couldn't look at any of Saddam's seats of power too long. And everybody that was with you, your minders from the secret police, would fall silent. And you were discouraged from actively pursuing any interest in any of these extraordinary structures. One of which was a vast palace, marble, with bronzes, gigantic bronzes of Saddam around it, and what looked like this kind of crowned helmet on his head. He was holding up. You remember this place, you guys? The dome, so I asked him about that one day. He said, "No, that's the Dome of the Rock. It's not a helmet. It's the Dome of the Rock." And Saddam called me, because he was also an architect and an artist, for advice on these things. And he tried to discourage him from, for instance, because he thought it was bad taste, but he lost that argument. And, he had performed operations on Saddam's corns and things like that. And once in his life, and I'll end on that, and this was, I guess, his real via crucis, his kind of terrible moment where this sort of Faustian pact he had made with Saddam brought its fruit, its poisoned fruit, into his life, which was Saddam summoned him to one of his palaces. That was the one that later became the place where American generals live. You know the one I mean? Radwani, I think, with all the lakes. And Saddam, he said, was in just after the... Huh?
Camp Victory.
Camp Victory, sorry. Yeah, exactly. The also appropriately renamed Camp Victory. This was right after he had been kicked out of Kuwait, and when the Shiites had revolted in the south, and there was lots of killing of his people, and they were coming closer to Baghdad. And the Allied forces, the Brits and the Americans, had basically stood by watching and had not reacted yet. Saddam summoned Allah to his and unusually took him for a walk in the garden, and he said he just exploded for 40 minutes, purple-faced. And it was just after a rain. It was an interesting sky. Being an artist, he remembered things like that. And I said, well, what was he telling you? And he said, he told me what he was planning to do. What he did in the succeeding, 3 weeks, was to kill anywhere between 100 and 150,000 people with the tacit connivance, really, of our powers who allowed him to do it and suppress that rebellion in a great slaughter, which, of course, came back to haunt everyone later on in the South. And I said, Allah, what did you do? What did you say? And he said, I didn't say anything. I just noticed the sunlight coming through his ear. And I was fixated on that. And I realized that for him it was, it became all about the ear, which I think was the title of the piece in our magazine, because it was the only way he could remove himself from the moment. And that became his moment, the moment in which he didn't, I think, stand up for all of those people, having that kind of trust with that dictator, at the risk of his own life, of course. So it's a strange relationship. I won't go on anymore, but it's difficult. For a long time, he didn't read the piece I wrote, and I realized after time, because it's quite harsh, and I do judge him. He is judged before us in his own words, in his own life. But he didn't read it for a long time.
And I understand he can't come back because he'll be assassinated.
Oh, no, he'll be assassinated, yeah.
Lynsey, I want to look at a couple of photographs that you took when you were there during that period.
Sure. Should I speak to them? Should I give
Yes,
you some
just describe each one briefly, if you would.
This is when they were unearthing the mass graves around Hilla. And this is the first time I've ever seen a mass grave. And it was so overwhelming to me to see these families trying to dig through these plastic bags and look for any shred of clothing that was left that might indicate the identity of whether or not it was their child or their husband. And I was so overwhelmed that when I went there, I actually couldn't even photograph for like the first half an hour. I just stood there and looked at these fields of plastic bags full of skulls and bones and the families. And there were just, a lot of the women were just, plopped down in the dirt, screaming and crying, and it was unbelievable.
Let's look at the next one.
This was at a funeral in Fallujah. This was, I think it was in early 2004 when they, for everything that happened in Iraq, they always blamed it on the Americans. And I remember a mosque had been bombed, and everyone was screaming that American planes came in and bombed this mosque. And there's a good rule of thumb that you should always go to the women. Sometimes the women are more honest than the men. And so I remember I sort of went off and found a few women, and I said, "Did you hear planes this morning?" They said, No, there were no planes. And it turned out there were men who were making bombs, and they exploded themselves. And so this was the funeral, but of course they said it was the Americans that had bombed them. So Iraq was a particularly hard place to report because for everything that happened, you got about 15 different stories, and it was very difficult to figure out what the truth was.
Dexter, you wrote from Fallujah during the Marines' assault in November 2004, and it was a series of pieces for the Times, as I recall. And the company you were traveling with lost an inordinate number of men, boys, actually. And you wrote in the piece, you described it as a leap into a different kind of battle. What did you mean by that?
Well, there was the battle itself, which was extraordinarily violent. We did it, I think, in 8 days. I was with a company of Marines, and a quarter of the guys were killed or wounded in 8 days. So it was very, very intense. But I think what I still remember from that time is, the violence was really intense, and it was nonstop and kind of around the clock, and that was extraordinary. But the part that does really stay with you is how young these soldiers are that we're sending over there. And I just couldn't ever get out of my mind that really I was playing a high school football game, and we were in the locker room beforehand, and everybody's slapping high fives, and they're all really excited, and they're wrestling with each other. And then we were like, going outside, and they were like killing people, and people were dying. And it was this kind of weird yin-yang thing that it just never could kind of, it haunts me still. And you see this in Afghanistan. of course, now. These guys are so young. I mean, some of them don't even shave, you know, and their voices haven't changed. And they're killing people, you know, and they're losing their limbs. And yeah, that's the weirdest thing about it to me. I can't get over that.
Well, I want to go back to the photograph that we started with and ask you, Lynsey, about that, exactly to this point, Dexter, because so few of us have had any direct experience, know these soldiers who have been fighting this war for so long. And this strikes me as just a classic war photograph. And can you just tell us a little bit about it? And did you have conversations with the men in this scene?
We actually, this was for a New York Times Magazine assignment, and I spent 2 months living in the Korengal Valley with Elizabeth Rubin. And I remember when we first wanted to start the assignment, Elizabeth had asked the commanders if we can go to this outpost, and they said, it's a place not fit for women. And we said, okay, that's exactly where we want to go. And so they said, you know, we have no idea how to accommodate you. And we actually slept in a bunker for 2 months, and that was where Tim and Sebastian Younger were. And so we got to know these guys very, very well because there was absolutely nothing to do. I mean, we literally sat on the side of a mountain, and every patrol we went on, we got shot at, mortared. It was incredibly violent. It was one of the most dangerous places in Afghanistan at the time. And at the end of the sort of the embed, we were going on a 6-day operation where we were going to look for Taliban, try to draw them out so that the troops could kill them. And so we were airlifted onto the side of a mountain in a valley that no Americans had been in years, and literally just plunked down in one of the most hostile areas and walked for essentially 6 days. And on the last day, and on the 5th day, we were ambushed and we were hit. We actually, when you're on these missions, you hear the comms of the Taliban. You hear them talking. We pick up, you know, the Americans can pick up all of the conversations going on with cell phones and with everything. So we knew they were getting closer because for days they said, we're getting closer, we're getting closer. We see hair, meaning they saw women. And so we knew it was imminent, but you just don't know when it's going to happen. And we were literally just sleeping on the side of a mountain in sleeping bags and our clothes. And so it was about 11 o'clock in the morning, and we were down on a ridgeline, and we were all sort of having MREs, those little meals. And I actually had to go to the bathroom, and the mountain was so steep that there wasn't a single place I could go and hide as a woman, you know, because you're with all men. And so I left my cameras on the ground and took my helmet off and actually climbed on all fours up the mountain and found a log. And I jumped over the log, and the minute I jumped over the log, bullets started coming from every direction. And I was alone, and I remember I was standing there, and I just got flat on the ground, and I was sort of digging myself into the ground behind this log, and I kept thinking, oh my God, if the Taliban comes from this side, I'm the first person they're going to find. And then I thought, the Americans are going to shoot at me because they don't even know I'm up here, you know. So I'm screaming, Elizabeth! And of course, no one can hear anything because it's full-on gun battle. And so at some point, there was like a minute-long lull in the shooting, and I just rolled like this all the way down the mountain. And I remember I got down, and there was this guy, Tanner Stichter, and he looks at me and he goes, get down, you know, screaming, and there's a lot of swearing going on. And I said, I need my cameras. And he looks at me, he was like, so I ran over and I found my cameras, I picked up my cameras, and so this goes on for quite a while, and we're all hiding behind these trees, and if you see the width of the trees in this photo, it's not enough to protect your body, right? So we're hiding behind trees like that to stop us from bullets coming from 3 directions. And finally, we pushed forward, and we heard that 3 men had been hit, and 3 of our guys had been hit. And as we were pushing forward, they were naming the ones who were hit. And I didn't, Rugal, the man who's being carried in this photo in the body bag, he was someone that we had actually gotten close to. And it didn't dawn on me. I remember them saying he had been hit, but it didn't dawn on me that we hadn't found him wounded yet. And as I was pushing forward, I found this guy Vandenberg, and he was covered in blood, and Stichter was giving him an IV. And so I stopped with him and was taking photos. And I couldn't find the rest of the photographers. I knew Tim Hetherington had been there, and I said, where is Tim? Because you always know that the photographers are where you want to be. And I said, maybe I'm in the wrong place. And as I'm standing there, these guys come out, and they're carrying Rugel's body, and the medevac was coming, the helicopter was coming, so all the dust is lifting up all around us. And it was this sort of apocalyptic scene of these guys carrying a body bag, and they're all crying. And when it dawned on me, it dawned on me that Rugel, I'd never seen him injured, and that must have been him. And I started crying. I was crying really hard because we had spent so much time with these guys. And it's very sensitive when you're with soldiers to photograph one of their dead. And so I said, I had to ask their permission, and it's such a sensitive moment. And so I went up and I said, is it okay if I take pictures? And they said yes. And so I just backed up and photographed the whole process. But it was very emotional.
Let's look at the next slide. I'm talking about casualties, but a different kind here.
This is a bit of a controversial photo. This was also in the Korengal Valley. This is one of the first nights that we were brought out to that base. Before we went on the embed, we spent 3 days in the TOC, which is the command center. And we were in there watching all of the screens and watching the fighting going on to try and get an idea of where we wanted to go. We wanted to go where there was the most fighting and where it was most intense. And so the night before we were brought out, there was a big attack, and we dropped 2, I think, 500 or 2,000 pound bombs, I have no idea, on this village. And we heard that there were a lot of civilian casualties. And so they surprisingly, they let us go out there to the base that was right in the middle of this. And the next morning, this little boy showed up, and he had shrapnel wounds all over his face. And so I was photographing the boy. And at the end of the 2 months, I submitted this along with all the other photos to the New York Times Magazine, and this was going to be the cover of the New York Times Magazine. And it was literally closing in about 2 hours, and right before it closed, the press officer for the U.S. military called or emailed the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine and said, we can't verify that this child was injured in that bomb attack. And they pulled the photo off the cover. And it was one of the very few times where I completely lost it professionally. And I said, you send us out there for 2 months, we risk our lives every single day, and you trust the PAO, the military press officer over us, we were on the ground every single day. And they pulled the photo. The photo never
What did they
ran.
run instead?
They ran a picture of Captain Kearney, the commander. It was, but it wasn't, to me this was much more powerful, but it never ran.
Jon Lee, in your latest piece from Afghanistan, you spent some time with a small contingent of American forces who were working with the Afghan police and army. And your main character pretty much, tell me if I'm wrong, but pretty much convinced you by the end of the piece that what we are trying to accomplish over there by working with these forces and training them isn't working. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was in Khost, which is a province right on the border with North Waziristan, one of the tribal territories of Pakistan, where what's in the paper every day, where the Haqqani network is based, and which carries out these attacks in Afghanistan and other places, which attacked the U.S. Embassy a week or so ago, and so forth. But this young lieutenant colonel was one of a series of well-intentioned young officers who was sent out there to patrol a pretty big swatch of territory right up to the border, and in which each time they came, they have about a year. They reintroduce themselves to the characters. They drink a lot of tea, and essentially are deceived and betrayed at every turn. That was both how, in his looser, more intimate moments, he characterized the war there. And it was definitely the war that I see, and I think it's the war that's increasingly beginning to be apparent to American readers. By and large, the Americans are confined to these great bases in some cases, in other cases, smaller ones, connected by aerial umbilical cords, in some cases, roads that they can travel on. He distrusted, for instance, not only was he fighting the Haqqani network and the Taliban, but distrusted his Afghan army commander, whom he believed had tried to kill him. And there was a specific episode that had occurred a few months before in which the two were supposed to pursue some suicide bombers that had entered the city. At the last minute, the commander didn't go. He had already begun to suspect the commander of various things, and lo and behold, within a few minutes of leaving the base, a vehicle exploded, killing other people, but not him. When I arrived, that other commander, the Afghan commander, had made himself scarce, and nobody knew where he was, and that was not the enemy; it was his Afghan counterpart. That's an increasingly worrisome part of the kind of Afghan picture, that there's an extraordinarily high number of incidents in which men in uniform fighting or serving alongside the Americans and other coalition forces suddenly pick up a gun and kill one or several. There's been numerous occasions where this has happened. And so it was a strange experience in which, you see these guys, they were coming to the end of their term. A lot of them just want to survive it. And yet they're soldiers, and they want to do the right thing, and they want to make some impact. And when you're with them as a reporter, of course, they try to show you that they try to be on message if they can. But there are times when, that is to say, trying to convince you that the mission is working and that they're actually going to achieve something. But I realized something later, which was that I had been there, a month or so, and I never once heard, on this last trip to Afghanistan, I never once heard any American officer tell me that they were winning. It was something, I don't know if they used that language a little bit earlier in the war. I haven't done that many embeds in Afghanistan, but I neither felt that they were winning, nor did anybody say that they were winning. And you got this, or I came away with this impression of this extraordinary military apparatus, which is, almost like Battleship America, just hovering above the ground in these bases at vast cost and causing great trauma to the soldiers there, in some cases to the people who live around them, and certainly this country back here. And I came away feeling very, very pessimistic, really. And I guess that it was reflected in the piece.
Dexter, you and Lynsey worked together on a story in 2008 in the tribal areas of Pakistan, which is under the control of the Taliban and is explicitly off limits to foreigners. Could you talk about that trip? And then I want to ask Lynsey as well.
Yeah, I wonder, do we have any photos from
We
that?
do.
From that? Yeah, that was.
Show the fighters.
That's not something I would do again. Yeah, this was in the summer of 2008, and Lynsey and I drove into the area you hear people talk about a lot, called the tribal areas. The formal term is FATA, the federally administered tribal areas, and it's this kind of almost literally ungoverned area along the Pakistan-Afghan border. And it's kind of, it's where the Haqqani network is based. It's where the Afghan Taliban have a lot of bases, and where the Pakistani Taliban are also. And it's kind of it exists in a kind of state of nature. There really is no government, and what you have is basically a series of most of them are kind of nominally Taliban, but they're just warlords with their little armies, and they control kind of pieces of territory. And some of them are fighting the Pakistan government, some of them are fighting the Americans. And so we went in there together. We just drove in. In fact, there's a sign when you get to the border of the tribal areas. There's literally a sign posted in English saying, no foreigners beyond this point. We kind of just sailed past it, but it was amazing though. It took about a month to arrange. I sat in a hotel room in Peshawar, the Pakistani city, working through these local Pakistanis who I had just kind of met on my trip there and hired on the spot, and who I trusted, or had to trust, and negotiating with these Taliban, this one particular Taliban commander named Haji Namdar, to come in and see him, basically, come in and see his little fief. And it took about a month to arrange, and I never thought it would work, and I was very, very frustrated. And then suddenly, and this often happens, I got the word. They said, Haji Namdar will welcome you at his abode inside Fatah, on Saturday at 12 o'clock or something. And so we hired about 30 guys with guns. I think they were all cousins, and they were all related to my translators. And we just drove in. But what was really amazing about it, it was kind of the whole conflict came into relief in that moment. We met this guy, Haji Namdar, and who was, God, if there's a photo of Haji Namdar, please put it up.
I don't think.
This kind of illiterate guy, very nice. In fact, it's a funny story. My translator said to me, they said to me, we should really bring Haji Namdar a gift. We should bring him something, and to show our gratitude. And I said, well, just buy something and expense it. And I tell everybody that. And so they said, okay, we'll get him a really nice Quran. And so we got a Quran and we got some purple wrapping paper and we put it in there. Anyway, and I met, when Lynsey and I walked in to see Haji Namdar, I gave him the Quran and I said, here's your gift. And he opened it up and he said, I have a gift for you. And he gave me his gift. And I opened it up and it was a Quran. Anyway, what was amazing...
Lynsey, did you get one too?
I didn't get any.
Yeah.
I wasn't supposed to be there.
But to cut to the chase, what was remarkable about it was it was literally in the middle during a so-called Pakistani military offensive against the Taliban in the tribal areas. And it was being played on television. I remember I'd watch the BBC and they would show the Pakistani tanks were kind of rolling in and the soldiers, and they were saying, the really dramatic stuff. They're taking on the Taliban. They're taking the fight to them. And because of the American pressure, et cetera, et cetera. And so we got in there, and there was, Haji Namdar, who apparently was, or ostensibly was supposed to be the target of this offensive, and he's just sitting in his house with his boys around him. And I said, well, Mr. Namdar, how come they're not coming after you? And he said, well, that's all theater. That's all for show. He said, I'm fighting the jihad. I'm sending guys into Afghanistan, and as long as I do that, I'm fine. I'm protected. No one's going to mess with me. No, not even the Pakistani government. And there it was, and so this whole, it was completely obvious to me that this entire, Pakistani offensive was kind of a joke, and it really was. And I, don't remember that moment the next time you hear about a Pakistani offensive in the tribal areas. But yeah, that was a crazy trip. I'm not sure I'd do that one again. But
What about you, Lynsey?
Well, I have to say that was I've known Dexter for 11 years or 12 years. It was the only time in my life I've not seen him in khaki pants and a white shirt. He actually wore the dishdasha, which thank God.
Did you take a picture of him?
Yeah, there's a very funny picture of the two
I look
of
like
us,
a CIA
on the
agent.
side. And the other thing is, they kept, over the time, I was very lucky because he just sort of called me 3 days before we got the go-ahead and said, okay, come in. So we went to Peshawar. And our translators kept saying, do not bring a woman. Haji Namdar keeps saying, don't bring a woman. And Dex and I were like, we're not separating. We're definitely going together. And so they were racking their brains trying to figure out how we can bring me in. And so finally, Halim said, one of the guys we were working with said, I got it. You're his wife. We'll just say he couldn't leave his wife alone. So they said, okay, so we get all dressed up, and there was not an ounce of skin showing. I was actually wearing wearing the Pakistani style of hijab, but it was the chador, and I was looking through my veil, and so we arrive at Haji Namdar's house, and they said, okay, you stay in the car because they said not to bring a woman. And so I'm sitting in the car, and Dex goes inside, and they get permission to bring me in. And so I remember I walk inside the room, and there are all these Taliban fighters. It's a very small room, and of course, I mean, no women ever leave their houses in this part of the country.
Yeah, you never see them.
Ever. Right. You never see a woman, not even in a burqa, nothing. You just don't see them. And so I walk in this room, and everyone just looks at me, and Dex has this very casual way of reporting. He says, Haji Namdar, this is my wife. And he's like, thank you very much for welcoming my wife. And so, you know, he doesn't look up, and I'm just standing there, and I sit down in the middle of the room, and Dex says, you know, my wife happens to have a camera. Is it okay if she takes some pictures? And I said, if he really believes this, it's insane. And he just said, yeah. Like, basically no one ever wants to deal with a woman because they don't even know how to deal with them. So they don't ask any questions once you show up, you know. And so that was it. We spent the day, and they let me take pictures.
And I should say, 6 weeks after we left, Haji Namdar was killed. By one of his own men. Yeah. Very unexplained. Yeah.
But Lynsey, getting back to your point about being a non-Muslim Western woman in this part of the world, judging from your photographs, you actually are able to capture some scenes, and you actually look at things a little bit differently than either the men would be able to or than they happen to. And I'd love you to talk about the next two photographs briefly. Who is this?
This is these are women, female Marines who were part of the female engagement teams that the U.S. military sent out attached to male Marines in southern Afghanistan to go and engage Afghan women. So the philosophy was, it was part of the counterinsurgency plan, and the philosophy was they wanted to start engaging Afghans more on a social level, personal level, and that would in turn produce intelligence, which I'm not really sure that it does produce any intelligence, and B, just soften the presence of the male Marines. And so I did several embeds with female Marines in Helmand and traveled around with them. And it was, you know, we've all seen pictures of war for many, many years now, and it's very hard as a photographer to shoot something different. It's very, very difficult to make a compelling image. And I think that one of the only ways for me is to photograph the women. I found it was really interesting to see these young girls, again, 18, 19, 20, 21, you know, very, very young women in there. Children, really, and they're on the front lines, and they're trying to engage Afghan women, and they go into households and have tea with Afghans, but most of them have never left their hometowns in America, you know, and then they're just parachuted over to Helmand or wherever they are, and it was incredible.
This next shot, I've seen it on your website, just, you know, is so startling. Just tell us the story behind that one.
It's a very surreal thing to watch the female Marines engaging Afghan women, because a lot of the Afghan women think that they're men until they take their helmets off, because you would never, if you see a female Marine walking through a village, you would assume it's a man, because they look, you know, there's nothing showing, their hair's not showing. And so a lot of the women in burqas, when they get approached by the American female soldiers, are terrified, and they start screaming and crying because they think they're being approached by men, which in Islam and in these villages in Afghanistan is totally taboo, and it's not acceptable culturally. So it's only when they realize they're women that they agree to be searched. But it's a very surreal scene because they've never seen women like this.
I also want to show one of the shots you took in Afghanistan while you and your interpreter, who is a woman, who is a doctor, were covering maternal health issues. And this, too, is just an amazing photograph. Tell us what was going on here.
This was last year, in 2009, I did a very big story for National Geographic where I spent about a year and a half photographing women in Afghanistan. And I started going to Afghanistan in 2000 when it was still under Taliban rule, and made 3 trips to Afghanistan under the Taliban. And so I've watched the country progress over many, many years, and I've returned every year since then. And so on this, when I got assigned the National Geographic story, I really wanted to show the different elements of women's lives in Afghanistan. And one of the things that Afghan women really grapple with is maternal mortality. They have the second highest rate of maternal mortality in the world. Many women die in childbirth because simply they can't access a hospital. They walk, many of them have to walk for 17 hours while they're in labor to get to a hospital. And so I was working on this with the United Nations Population Fund. They were helping take me around and facilitate the trip into these very remote villages. And on the way back, I was with my translator, Dr. Ziba, and we were driving down this road, and I looked up and I saw two women in burqas standing on the side of the road, which is a very rare sight in Afghanistan because usually every woman is accompanied by a man. Most women are not allowed out of their house unless they have a male escort called a mahram. And so I said, stop the car. And so we stopped the car, and Dr. Ziba and I ran up, and it turned out that the woman was in labor. The woman on the right of the frame, she was in labor. Her water had just broken. And her husband's first wife had died in childbirth, and he was so determined to not have her die in childbirth that he rented a car. And they were driving to the hospital, which was a 4-hour drive. And in that drive, their car broke down. And so the husband had gone to find another ride to take her, and she was meanwhile in labor on the side of the road. So I said, well, just get in the car, I'll take you to the hospital. And they said, we can't get in the car without our husband's permission. So I had to send Dr. Ziba to find the husband who had gone off. And fortunately, there's only one road in the entire countryside. And so she went and she found the husband, and I piled them all in the car and took them to the hospital, and she delivered. But she had never, that was her first time in her life in a vehicle, and so she threw up the entire way. She was so car sick. She threw up in the back seat of the car the entire way, and then made it and delivered safely.
Jon Lee, Lynsey made a decision in this case to get involved with her sources. How do you make the decision about when to get involved and when just you have to walk away?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably all of us have been in some variation of this kind of very human circumstance. And I think, well, everybody reacts differently, but I have no compunction with crossing whatever. If there is a line, just crossing it. If it has to do with, a human in distress, if you have the opportunity to help them, then, you intervene. That's the way I see it anyway. Yeah, no question.
Wendy, were there any bad moments in Tahrir Square? You were there during those key moments. There was gunshot throughout the square. You were in some pretty dicey situations.
It was bad for sort of 3 or 4 days. It was unclear and uncertain. There was a lot of gunfire at night, and it was thuggy in the margins of Tahrir because Mubarak, the sort of last gasp of the Mubarak regime was to send in pro-Mubarak gangs and crowds to try and push the protesters off the square. And that was the Day of the Camels, which you will remember, the sort of totally surreal and extraordinary sight of the camels bobbing up through the great mass of people. And that night there was a big battle that was Molotov cocktails mostly, and a lot of rock throwing, and people got a lot of head injuries and so forth. And there were some gunshot wounds, but it seemed vestigial and marginal. But for the next 3 or 4 days, this sort of seething pro-Mubarak crowds, somehow hired, somehow organized, somehow maybe parts not, parts genuine perhaps, gathered at certain entrances and around the streets, and they were particularly angry with foreigners and particularly angry with foreign journalists because the regime had put out on the national state networks that we were the agents, that it was the people on Tahrir were foreign agents, that they had dollars in their pockets, that they were all famously eating Kentucky Fried Chicken. That was the great put down, you Kentucky Fried Chicken eaters, destroying the country. And so a lot of colleagues, and there were a lot of journalists, particularly camera people, photographers and camera crews who got roughed up by these thugs, and getting in and out of the square was difficult. But I'm very much the non-intrepid one. I'm not I'm kind of run in the opposite direction, stand around the corner, move slowly towards it. So I did a lot of standing on the balcony and looking at it, and then we would go down early in the morning, try and be back before curfew, try not to push the envelope too far. I'm tend to be on the more kind of cautious end of it.
And have any of you been in a situation where your interpreter, your source, your minder, where you have put him or her in harm's way unintentionally? And that raises all kinds of interesting moral questions about the people that you're involving in your work.
Well, I mean, that happens all the time. Yeah. It's always more dangerous for them than it is for you. I mean, I'm just thinking, when I was in Pakistan, this last time I just spent about 6 weeks there, the ISI, the spy agency there, they came to my hotel like every third day and kind of checked up, and they went into my room, but that wasn't that. I didn't feel like we're at the point yet in Pakistan. We might not be very far away from it, where if you're a Western reporter, you're going to be killed by the state. You might be killed by somebody else, but not by the ISI. So I didn't feel terribly nervous about that. They tap the phones and all that, and they try to figure out what you're doing. But they were threatening my interpreter. Every day they were coming to him, and they would go to his friends, and so his friends would come to him and say, you better stop working with that American. And for that matter, they were threatening everybody that I interviewed. So it makes it impossible to work, for one thing. But they're always in more danger than we are, because they have. We can leave. They have to stay.
Well, and Wendy, you were recently in Damascus, and that's a country that most journalists have not been able to penetrate. Describe. We heard a little bit from Jon Lee earlier what it was like under Saddam. What is the situation there? The Arab Spring has unfolded there very differently than it has in Cairo, for instance.
Damascus is very odd. I had not expected it to feel as tense and as paranoid and as pleasant and difficult as it was, because ostensibly you have a main capital city that's going about its daily business, and there were traffic jams, and the restaurants are open, the cafes are there, and it's weirdly a bit empty because there are no tourists there. Suddenly you're walking down the street and you realize there are no other foreigners in the city at all, except for a couple of diplomats, and they've planned their exit strategy. And it's surreal. Before I went, I decided that I would, because the crackdown has been going on for a long time, because so many people are being imprisoned, because the arrests are constant and arbitrary, and the prison situation with it's very bad, and the torture is extremely unpleasant. People have been, they're hung up, they're electrocuted. You can be taken typically for a week or 10 days, but 2 months, 4 months, disappeared. There are a lot of talk of mass graves, of summary executions in streets, all sorts of. It's very extreme. It's very unpleasant. People that I was talking to were protesters, largely, and activists in Damascus who had either been arrested or were in direct threat of being so. And they all had friends who'd been arrested and tortured. And so I remember going in, and I have friends in Damascus. I spent a lot of time there in 2005, 6, 7. And I just thought, first, do no harm. What I can do, who I can talk to, what they're willing to say, how they're willing to say it, is all I can manage.
Were they afraid to talk to you?
In some cases they were, but I was surprised. The humbling thing was that even the paranoia and the fear was very palpable. You could see it in everybody's gestures. When you were sitting in a cafe, the minute somebody walked into the cafe, you'd stop talking, the voice would go lower, you'd look towards the door, who is it, you'd check them out. You'd only go to cafes where people knew the owners or had known the waiter from beforehand. I was writing all my notes in the margins of books and on napkins, and then flushing them down the toilet, making sure I had no hard copies of anything on me and this sort of thing. But what I noticed amid all the paranoia was that there were these extraordinary people who had somehow just broken through the fear barrier. They just decided they were not going to be afraid. And they were going to protests and getting shot at, or being arrested and getting out and going back to protests, and they've been doing it for months. And there were people reacted to the situation in different ways. Some friends of mine had gone early to protest, been arrested or roughed up, and were frightened to go again, or felt guilty about not wanting to go again, or stopped for a while. But there were a significant portion of people I talked to who had just decided that they were not going to be frightened anymore. And that was extraordinary to see that.
Before we open it up for questions, I want to end on a slightly lighter note and have all of you, or some of you, whoever wants to speak up, talk about some of the more bizarre or unusual experiences you've had that don't make it into your stories.
Who should go? Well, I'll just, Jon Lee, this isn't lighter, I don't think, but when Jon Lee mentioned the Saddam statues in Baghdad, when the palace was dismantled, not dismantled, but when the regime fell, a lot of the heads were taken off the top of the statues. And when I was in Iraq, I got to know he was the national security advisor in Iraq for a long time. He may still be. His name was Muwaffaq al-Rabai, and he had been he's an Iraqi, and he had moved to London where he was a practicing neurosurgeon. And then when the revolution happened, he moved back. And I used to go see him a lot and sit in his office, and occasionally he would invite me over to his house. And years before, maybe 15 years before, Dr. Rabai, who's a very charming man, very soft-spoken, had been tortured by the Baathists in the most kind of surreal way. And he described it for me once, being kind of tied up in a ball and kind of spun around like a fan for days on end. And yeah, it just makes you wonder, like, what who thought of that,
Well, yeah, Dexter, this is a downer. Is this good?
No. I'll end. The
Amazing
thing was,
a bit different.
but here was, and he was a guy who had a personal and vested interest in the collapse of the regime. And when I used to go see him at his house and sit in his office, over in the corner, he had one of the heads of Saddam from the statue. And it was looking at it, it was pointed directly at his desk, and he would sit there and talk to you and Saddam was in the room with him. It was just an amazing thing. It made me think of it.
Jon Lee, tell us about your hotel accommodations in South Sudan, which I understand were a little unusual.
I was thinking of another,
whichever's better.
Crazy one, but I'll... Well, I was in South Sudan not too long ago for the independence of that country. They seceded from Sudan in this summer. And Juba, which is more or less accessible only by air and one very bad road to Uganda, is a boom town in the middle of the bush. And it's in an extraordinarily small place, which because there is oil and there's been a lot of international aid, including U.S. aid, there's a lot of money visible on the few, I think it's 4 kilometers of paved road. And so there's Range Rovers, and with the plastic still on the seats, they keep the plastic on the seats, like some people, have, like a certain type of woman used to leave on her sofas. And but all of the hotels, I was quite surprised because all of the hotels are not really hotels, they were container yards. And so I stayed in a very expensive container at the New Yorker's expense this summer in Juba. It was kind of extraordinary. But you leave this future capital city where the most prominent construction taking place were flagpoles going up, and there were these 2 Chinese, of course Chinese are building everything in Africa, Chinese flagpole engineers who were there working around the clock. These 2 guys are very angry. Every time I went to check on them, they would scowl at me. And they were working and they were trying the remotes. They had erected these steel flagpoles, and they had to do it right down to the minute so that Sudan's flag would go down and South Sudan's flag would go up just at the same moment. And they managed to pull it off, but I don't know. There's lots of funny little stories. But
Let's look at one final shot of Lynsey's. Different kind of scene in Baghdad. What was going on here? This is a wedding, obviously. Tell us a little bit about what you were witnessing.
I recently went back to Baghdad for the first time in 6 years for National Geographic. I did a story on Baghdad coming back to life. And it was very interesting to go back after so many years, because the last image I had of Iraq when I left was complete chaos and destruction and bombs every day and a lot of violence. And it actually is slowly coming back to life. I mean, there is a lot going on. And one of the things that's happening is there are weddings, about 10 weddings a day, every day, every day of the week. It's as if people are making up for lost time and during the height of the war. And so I basically became a wedding crasher on this assignment. The assignment was about 6 weeks long. And for the first trip, I was there a little over 3 weeks, and I went to one, if not two, weddings every single day, and just went. And because it's hard as a photographer, you're looking for so many different elements, and most Iraqis were pretty open to being photographed, which is unlike Afghanistan, which is almost impossible to find a woman who will let you take her picture. But it actually became quite fun, because I was learning a lot about what was going on outside of the wedding, and got a lot of other ideas for what to shoot, and would just hang out and talk to people at these weddings. So it was, and Iraqis are very welcoming and very hospitable. So I literally would go to a wedding every day.
Okay, on that note, we're going to open it up for questions from you. And there are going to be microphones, I believe, in the front. Yes, here they come. So if you could come up and ask into the microphone so everybody could hear, that would be great. Yes, over here.
Okay. First of all, as I'm sure everyone here is blown away with what you're doing with your life, and my life feels incredibly meaningless now, but, that being said, though, what makes you keep doing it? Because what's really, you're doing it because it needs to be done. The story needs to be told, but I imagine you're hoping that's going to affect some change, and I get a little depressed thinking there's not as much change as all of us would like to see, so does it feel a little futile, and yet you keep going? I mean, what keeps you going, I guess, is the question.
What keeps you going? Anybody?
It's just a great job when you get to go and ask people questions, and you get to ask all sorts of people questions, important people and little people and people in the street. And it's just fun and curious, and no 2 days are the same. And I always wanted to write stories, and discovered quite early on that I wasn't so good at making them up. But other people's stories are fascinating, and that's what keeps me going back.
Anybody else?
That's pretty good.
Yes, over here.
Yeah. When you go into a country like Libya or Sudan, where very little is known, how do you get background information to give context to the day-to-day events in your reporting?
Well, I think each of us has a different system, but I suppose we all share the same thing. We read what we can, especially if it's a place we haven't been before. We reach out to friends and colleagues who've been there, and sometimes we just wing it and hope for the best, and hope that our intuition and what I think you eventually acquire over time is a kind of, I would call it, educated intuition. You sort of know there's certain tropes that you respond to and that kick in. If you go down an abandoned road, or a road where there's no people, if you've gone down for about half a kilometer or so, it's usually a danger sign, and even if you don't know the language of the place and really what's going on in the society. I'm thinking back to like my second day in Tripoli. It wasn't clear where Gaddafi's people still were, and I actually got out of a car where I had a feckless driver because I hadn't seen any rebels for quite a while, or anyone at all, in fact. And we were in an urban area, and he fecklessly went on ahead and ran into a gun battle, immediately. So my intuition was right. Sometimes it's only that. It's an interesting one about Libya that I felt quite chagrined because I realized that as much moxie as I think I have and years on the ground and as savvy as I think I am about and interested in and fairly well up on most current affairs, when I got to Libya back in the spring, I realized after a while, when I was in this liberated city and amongst these young rebels, everybody talking at once, this kind of new babble that had arisen in the, because it could, in a place that had been mute for 40 years, that I really knew very little about Libya, and that very few of us actually did, and still do. It's a nation that's barely found an identity. Gaddafi has dominated it for essentially the television age. Really for most of since LBJ was in office, and most of us had begun, I think, to see that entire country and that entire society through the prism of this buffoonish seeming madman, and I felt chagrined about that, and I redoubled my efforts to try to rediscover it for myself. Something which is still ongoing. And I think Libyans are in that position too. So, but yeah, you do what you can. Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah, I want to thank you all. I've just lived for the reporting I've been getting over the last few years from all of you. I was particularly struck by the picture that was going to go on the New York Times Magazine and was pulled at the last minute on the wise counsel of the American military. And I would just like to assure you that everybody in this room and tens of thousands of people around the country know perfectly well that given a choice between you guys and the American military, whom to believe.
Thank you.
All right. I have two historical parallels that have been rattling around my brain, in one case for months and in one case for years, and I'd like to just present them to you, and then anything any of you want to say to refute it or possibly even agree, I'd be delighted. One is with Libya. For some reason, our press decided early on that they were going to compare this to Iraq. And to me, this was just like a completely random idea. And it made me so disturbed that as the months went by, I kept finding more and more parallels between Libya and the American Revolution. But of course, nobody in America knows any history, so they don't realize this. We just have this nice, clear, we defiant people went out and won our freedom. But we don't know what's going on in the minds of those Libyan rebels. Who are they really?
So what is the question?
Okay, the question is, I just like reaction, if any of them think I'm completely crazy. But the other historical parallel, really fast, is that the thing that a lot of people have been thinking about, but we're not military, we're not reporters, but in the last few months there have been so many revelations about the utter corruption in every possible way in Afghanistan. And that's what finally made me think, this really is Vietnam. And there's never going to be a resolution, I think, okay? But so those are just these two little parallels that have been troubling me, and I just like any reaction.
Any response?
Well, I'll offer a quick one to the first. I think, you're talking about reporters doing the best they can in an area that's, as I was saying to the last questioner, Libya was a place that was really unknown and very closed off until very recently. And those journalists who had the opportunity to go there were generally guided and somehow blinkered. And most of them honestly reported what they could see about the place. But it was a closed society. So there were analogies to Saddam's Iraq. After all, Gaddafi, and this is analogous in the sense that, yet again an Arab dictator is being toppled by force. The last time that happened, with the exception of Mubarak, where there was a new a new and anomalous situation was Saddam. The difference was, of course, the American military wasn't intervening directly, but there was assistance of the indigenous rebels by a NATO coalition that included the United States, mostly air power. And so there were some analogies, and somehow it's a bookend to this decade of war on terror that began with 9/11, proceeded with the invasion of Afghanistan and then Iraq. And you know, I think one has to view the Arab Spring as an unexpected yes, but nonetheless an outgrowth of the history that's just come before. The Arab world has been in really volatile kind of effervescence for the last decade, and what we're witnessing throughout the Arab world is at least partly sparked by what came before. So I don't know that our colleagues have made overly much, as you point out, of the comparisons between Iraq and Libya, but nonetheless, it's worth keeping Iraq in mind. I think, in fact, that if there's a sin of omission in the media, it is, in fact, and I include myself in this. You went back after 6 years. I haven't been back now, I guess, in 3. But it's that Iraq, which so dominated our consciousness for so long, has somehow, maybe we were sickened by what we saw or did there, and it just entered this realm of white noise that we don't really want to look at or acknowledge anymore. But I think it's always good to be mindful of other experiences.
I just want to say, I think my impression comes more from the commentators who haven't been within thousands of miles of Libya.
Okay, next question over here.
Hi, thank you. I forget sometimes when I look at the photographs that you put your lives on the line to bring them to us. My question is, when you are challenged to photograph the darkest midnight of the human condition, how do you find the balance when you get back and you don't get consumed with it and remember that most of humanity is lovely?
I guess that's for me.
Yes, actually.
I think in the moment when I'm photographing, I am very focused on the moment, so it's not about me, it's about the person I'm photographing. I think when I get home, there is time to process what I've seen, and it's hard sometimes. I mean, I'm very lucky to still have not lost my mind. I think, I've been through a lot, and I've photographed a lot of people going through a lot, and I think it's very important to realize that I am, as a photographer, and all of us as journalists are very lucky to go and to be able to leave, and the people we work with and the people that we document have to live those lives forever and have to be in those conditions indefinitely. And I think, I feel very, very lucky to be to have the ability to go in and out of people's lives and to still have my own life.
Over here.
Jon Lee Anderson, in your recent piece about the war in Sri Lanka, I really loved it, and it was sort of a brutal expose of the last days of the war and the Sinhalese victory. It seemed to me after reading it, I can't imagine that you could ever go back there. And my question to all of you is, you go to these places, you write some honest expose of what's happening, and then it seems to me it's probably written off the list for you, because if you ever showed up, I would assume you're on some list that you don't want to be.
Well, in the case of Sri Lanka, I assume that I'm persona non grata. There's someone close to the regime who seems to be fixated with attacking me in the press, and so and he used to be a minister. So I think it follows that they're pretty upset. So until the regime changes, I probably won't be able to go back there. Yeah, there are times when you can't go back to a country. I think we probably all have countries we can't go to, but occasionally you can sneak into them, and that's also a possibility. Not with Sri Lanka, and I'm not declaring any intention here, but.
But can I just jump in on Sri Lanka? Yeah. Sri Lanka is It is unbelievably violent, but it is so spectacularly beautiful. It's like, it looks like, I mean, really, it looks a lot like Cuba. It's green with mountains. The beaches are extraordinary. There's all these old kind of, you know, these beautiful Buddhist temples. And it's always whipsawing you when you're there because it's so gorgeous, and the people are lovely. And they brutalize each other just to a degree that is unimaginable. It's very strange. But I just went there. I spent a lot of time there in the 90s, and I just went on vacation there last year. So.
Yes, over here.
Yes, this question is for Mr. Filkins. I just want to let you know your article about Pakistan was extraordinary.
Okay.
But just last week, America's top military officer, Mike Mullins, stood up and basically implicated the ISI and the Haqqani network in front of the world media. So I want to know what your opinion was about what was the message, what's the reason he stood up and basically in public implicated? What message is the administration or the DoD trying to send by doing that?
Well, there, you know, it's the administration. There's no, you know, it's not monolithic, and so, but what Admiral Mullen said, which is that the ISI is essentially fighting against us. I mean, these are the guys we're giving $3 billion a year to. They are basically acting as our enemies. What he said is basically known, right? Everyone in the U.S. military knows those facts. What was remarkable about it is that he said it publicly, and that's what kind of changed it. But you know, this conversation, the things that he was saying. I mean, I've had that conversation. I think we all have many times. The Pakistanis are working against us, and we're pretending publicly like they're our allies. And Admiral Mullen's just an amazing guy. I mean, he really is. I mean, he's retiring in a couple of weeks. But he's done that on several occasions. In the case of the Pakistani journalist that I wrote about who was murdered, basically it was Admiral Mullen who said that the Pakistani government did it, and he said it publicly. So what's remarkable is just that he came out in public and said it.
Was there a reason that just because he's retiring he feels like he can say it, or is there an underlying message that he wanted to make public?
Well, I think it's kind of cognitive dissonance. I mean, for 10 years now, the U.S. has been writing these enormous checks and kind of waiting for the moment when Pakistan will act like our friend. And in some ways, they do act like our friends. You know, we send out 85 or 90% of our supplies through Pakistan to Afghanistan. And so whenever you have these conversations with, say, a senior American military officer, they would always say, well, yeah, we know they're doing the bad stuff, but we think they're going to come around next week, next month, next year. And I think, you know, for Admiral Mullen, I don't want to speak for him, but I think people are beginning to realize that maybe that's never going to happen. And we are at year 10, so yeah.
Okay, we have time, I'm sorry, just for one more question.
First of all, I think we can all applaud the fact that this kind of journalism and photojournalism is available to us. And we can see it in this country, and for that, I think everyone here is thankful for this kind of journalism. I would just like to say that all of you have written and done things that have influenced the opinions of many Americans. To what degree do you, and obviously what's happened in terms of public policy and even public opinion has changed, but to what degree do you personally sense that what you've done has actually brought you some gratification in the sense that something has changed as a result of the work that you've done?
Good final question.
Not much. Not much. That's your answer? Not much.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think it's not very tangible. It's not something that we know immediately. I think, you know, we probably all get emails from readers or from people who see our work around the world and say, hey, you've changed my life or you've changed my opinion. And to me, that's enough. I mean, if I can affect one person, you know, or however many, I mean, that means a lot. I think I much prefer being out there and trying to educate people than sitting at home.
Could I, you know, I was, this is when I was working for the New York Times, but particularly in the first few years of the Iraq War, were very, very difficult because it was, if you were on the ground there, as all of us were, it was so easy to see that this giant enterprise in this country were kind of disintegrating. That became clear on April 9th. 2003 when the regime fell. And, you know, we were all kind of doing our best and trying to report as clearly and as fairly as we could, but the facts are the facts. And so you all remember those days. They were terrible days. And I just remember, you know, every day we were kind of, the facts that we were trying to send out of Iraq were kind of at war with the official version, and it certainly seemed for a long time like the official version was gonna prevail, no matter what the reality was on the ground, and that was kind of depressing. The emails, yeah, you wake up every morning and there'd be like 50 of them, people saying you're getting people killed, you hate America, you know, the whole thing, and that I don't get those emails anymore. I mean, I think the truth. It took a long time, but the truth came out, you know, and the truth prevailed finally, and in that sense, it's very gratifying. You know, nobody would argue that what happened in Iraq between, say, 2003 and 2007 wasn't a catastrophic kind of series of events, and so it took a while, but the truth won. You know.
Jon Lee, you want to have the final word?
Hmm?
Do you want to have the final word?
Yeah. I guess that's right. I think it's. Like Lynsey was saying, there are personal, often very private stories, you know, where you know you've maybe had an effect or someone has let you know and you become gratified by that. And I think you cling to these things. How much one shapes debate can sometimes seem an uphill battle. But what Dexter was saying is true. I was just remembering that in spring of 2004, during the uprising in Fallujah in the South, a prominent American columnist attacked me in print for having used the word insurgent to describe those fighting the American military.
That was a prohibited word at the time.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
So there has been. I mean, facts on the ground ultimately have changed the shape of perceptions and opinions, and I guess we have a place in that. But most of the time, I'm not sure that unless you're actively seeking a pundit's role, that you're trying to shape public opinion. You're just trying to do the best you can and getting the facts on the ground and communicating it to your audience. And I think that's what we do over and over again.
Okay, I want to thank you all so much, our panelists and our audience.